Now live. Look at that. Live. So it's weirdly lit in here for those of you on Facebook. I keep changing things to like figure out a way to have bright light in here, and I just keep not finding it. So there you go. Just keep not finding it. Someday I will find it. Oops, let me get that mic a little closer. Okay, so hey, here we are. This is some live office hours, so a little early, as you likely know if you come to my live office hours regularly. These are a little earlier than normal. Got some other stuff going on today. I'm a little distracted by two teenagers outside my window there who are clearly trying to start a lawn keeping business or something like that, and who are trying to decide which doors they should knock on to ask whether they need their lawn done. Anywho, not my door. Anywho, my name is Dr. Sharon Coates. I develop resources for voice teachers, resources and classes for voice teachers around voice pedagogy. And if you're going to be at NATS Chicago, I hope you'll come and see me. Hope you'll come and see our presentation that we're doing. A bunch of Canadians all talking about voice pedagogy, and they started the lawnmower. Well, that is amazing timing, isn't it? Amazing. Anyway, talking about voice pedagogy, and we'll be doing that on Canada Day at NATS Chicago. So anyway, something to consider if you will be there. I am coming to you live from the north of Toronto on the traditional lands of the Haudenosaunee, the Anishinaabe, the Mississauga and the Wendat Neo and Seo peoples. Just for kicks and giggles, my pronouns are she, they. So that's something to think about. Here we go. So today, I wanted to get this thing up. Let me just grab this as well. Today, talking about some juicy conversation today. Some juicy things, which is what someone on, I think, Instagram said when I talked about what I was going to talk about today, when I posted about what I was going to talk about today. So I'm just talking about Western classical or classical styles. And talking about a conception of Western classical / classical styles, and our conception of, and the way that we think about these styles. And this kind of came out of last week? I think it was last week. Maybe it was the week before. I don't know. Who knows? I think it was last week, where I did a couple of classes on contemporary singing, and talking about contemporary styles and producing contemporary styles, producing those tonal outcomes. And the reason that I talk about classical versus contemporary, like there are folks out there who are like, it's all the same instrument, and like it's all functional, and we're just creating, like you just decide which sound it is. It isn't necessarily that one is classical and one is contemporary. And I understand that. I understand where that comes from. I understand that point of view. And at the same time, the reason that I talk about contemporary sounds versus classical sounds, the reason that I make that distinction is because so many of us have either come through the Western classical pipeline, and I'm going to talk about why I say Western classical in just a minute, but so many of us have come through that Western classical pipeline, or were taught by people who came through the Western classical pipeline. And I can't tell you, I've said this so many times, I can't tell you the number of folks who I have worked with personally, who did jazz degrees, who did music theater degrees, who have never taken a classical lesson in their lives, who have never done a classical lesson, or who have never done it past high school, who, when I work with them, are listening to sounds and whose understanding of sound production is through a Western classical lens. So the description of a sound, what they think is I'm going to put in quotes, good, but what they think a breath should look like, what they think an inhalation should be, what they think is a good, useful way to shape the vocal tract, et cetera, et cetera. All of those things are through a Western classical lens, through this prism of Western classical tonal outcomes and the way we produce those sounds. So yes, it's the same instrument, and yes, if we understand function, it's really just a stylistic change. What am I doing? How am I going to use my voice in a slightly different way to create these different stylistic tonal outcomes? However, in reality and practicality, the vast majority of us do not understand what the functional difference is, because we have this like Western classical lens that colors everything and colors the way we see things. So an example of this is just, I'm not going to call you out, but if you feel like you want to like tag yourself, feel free. But an example of this is someone who did the contemporary anatomy and physiology class that I did last weekend, who's been going through the replay, and keeps sending me emails saying, oh my gosh, okay, that's why this belt sound I was trying to get, that's why it wasn't working, because I kept asking them to have this low released inhalation. I kept asking them to have this like buoyancy in the ribs, and what they actually needed was a little bit more, they needed to be a little bit more stable in the ribs. So they actually needed to lock in a little bit. But I never even considered that as a possibility because of my Western classical training. So as soon as I said to them, oh, hey, look at you, you're up early. You're always up early, I'm sure, but anyway, hey. It's a little earlier today than normal. So because they had been looking at the breathing and the body alignment as through that Western classical lens, it hadn't even occurred to them, even though they know voice ped, they know how the voice works, they know functional singing, they have excellent training, and they are an excellent singer themselves, right? Hey, Wendy, not much, I don't think you missed anything. But like, even though they know that information, it hadn't translated that they were looking at the breathing of the singer they were working with and for themselves. It hadn't translated that they were looking at that through a Western classical lens. So they were looking at this low, buoyant exhalation and thinking, yep, that's the way it should be. I wonder why we can't get the pressurization level we need in order to create this belt tonal outcome, or whatever the tonal outcome is. Why can't I get that pressurization level? Oh, wait, that's right. If I take away a little bit of the buoyancy in the ribs, if I take away a little bit of the buoyancy in the torso, and if I allow myself to have a little bit more lock in, right? If I allow myself to have just a little bit more steadiness in here in order to stabilize the larynx so I can resist the pressurization better, that's way more effective to get my tonal outcome. Why didn't I think about it? Because I was looking at that body and that breathing through a Western classical lens. So yes, it is the same instrument. And yes, it's all about functional training. And yes, maybe there isn't as much of a difference between the tonal outcomes or the stylistic outcomes as we think there is. And yes, maybe I'm making more of a divide between the styles than is necessary, except that when we are all still looking at our singers or looking at ourselves through that Western classical lens, we don't realize yet what we're missing unless I make it explicit. Unless I say, hey, this is what we're thinking about in Western classical singing, and here's where you need to change that a little bit and look a little bit different for other tonal outcomes. So that's why I make this divide between contemporary and classical sounds, right? Oh, hey, Kathy. Yeah, that's why I make that divide between those two those two kinds of tonal outcomes, and that's why I talk about it in terms of anatomy and physiology, and that's why I do a classical versus contemporary. It's not because I think they're at odds with each other. I think it's because we have all these conceptions around what it means to sing well, and that you don't even have to be a Western classically trained singer to have these preconceptions, to see things through a Western classical lens. You don't even have to. So true. I love Michelle. It's like peanut butter. Sometimes you use it for cookies, and sometimes you use it for Thai spicy sauce. Exactly. But like, unless someone says to you, hey, you know that peanut butter you could use for cookies is also amazing in like Thai spicy sauce, you're not going to think about it because you're only going to think about peanut butter for cookies, right? Like, unless someone like makes it explicit. And it's not like they're verses. It's not like they're two like, the opposites of each other, or sort of. They're just like, yeah. Are you talking about locking in and not using the lower abs on the onsets? I'm trying to make a quick question. Locking in and not. I'm not. Wendy, that's a question for like a whole other thing. I know what you're asking. It's a question for a whole other thing. I'm just talking in general, where when we look through a Western classical lens in terms of what we think the body should be doing, or how we should be shaping the vocal tract, how we should be breathing, we often don't realize that the thing that we have internally is that the thing that we have a bias around, let's say, is not actually useful for other tonal outcomes, right? Even if we have a really good understanding of functional voice, even then, we still need to have these conversations. Okay, so the first question that I asked in my post a while back, the first question that I asked this week was, how do we define Western classical, or how do we define classical singing? And so I want to just get a little bit in the weeds in terms of philosophy and understanding. Yes, it's along the lines of the no tension myth. It's exactly that as well, right? Oh, you should never have any tension when you're singing. Well, that really all depends on what you mean by tension. Because we want engagement, lots of it, in lots of different ways. And relaxation is not useful. Like overall, just relaxation, that's not useful in many ways. Okay. So I want to veer off a little bit in terms of like just understanding the human need to categorize things and the human need to like define things, right? So we have this need to categorize, but language lets us down. So how does language let us down? Let's say, for example, I'm gonna explain to someone who has never seen a dog before what a dog is. Okay, so a dog has a tail. Oh, but there are some dogs who don't have tails, who only have that little stubby nub. Does that mean they're not a dog? No. Okay, so dogs have 4 legs. Well, some dogs don't have 4 legs. Some dogs, only have 2 legs. They are missing a limb. Okay, fine. So dogs bark. All dogs bark. Well, some dogs what is the definition of bark? Some dogs have different bark sounds. All dogs have 2 ears. No, not true. All dogs have a wet, black nose. Nope, also not true. Not the problem when we start to try to define things define a group of things by creating characteristics for that thing, by describing their characteristics, is that the very nature of the description, the language, lets us down, because we don't have, how can you describe the essence of something unless it's something really simple like a box, right? How can you, and even then, try describing a box so that the next time someone who's never seen a box before, next time they see a box, they actually know what it is. How? We're gonna have this massive long description of all of these and caveats and caveats and caveats and caveats. Oh, and there's an exception to that rule too. So the issue with creating a definition for something like classical singing, for example, is that everything that we say is the thing that describes classical singing. There's an exception to it. So how do we create a definition for classical singing? So basically what we come down to, and this is what we come down to with all descriptions is we come down to creating this like sort of these Venn diagrams essentially of like, does it have this, and this, and that thing in the middle? That's the thing. So we have this like all of these things that it could be, and then the thing in the middle is the actual thing. So that's how we tend to start to describe things. That's the way that we end up describing things. And there's a whole theory around this. And I actually don't remember where I read this. I read it recently, but I don't even remember now. So if someone knows where I read that, let me know. This is not my idea. This is way beyond my pay grade, but like, if someone remembers where I saw that, let me know. But there is a relatively, I think, a pretty good definition of Western classical style in Lynn Helding's book, The Musician's Mind. So this is on page 72. Western classical tradition of singing is distinguished by a large pitch range, sustained breathing, natural amplification, meaning not amplified, not on a mic, seamless register shifts, and agile execution of rapid scale passages. So are there exceptions to all of those things in our Western classical singing? Like, yes. Extended, what'd you say? Sustained breathing. So recit, that isn't necessarily sustained breathing, right? With, I feel. Michelle says she feels. I think you're gonna finish that in just a minute. I feel. It can be a whole sentence. That can be a whole sentence, Michelle. Totally. So do we have songs that do not have large pitch ranges? Of course. Are there other styles that have large pitch ranges? Of course there are. Do we have natural amplification? Yes. And also sometimes opera is mic'd. And are there other styles that have natural amplification? Sure. You do an acoustic set at the local bar, that is not amplified, right? That is natural amplification. Seamless register shifts. Well, sometimes we don't have seamless, come scoglio, like that, come scoglio. What do I do in come scoglio? I show my register change in come scoglio, right? So there are exceptions to this. And there are certainly other styles that have as part of the traits a more seamless register transition. And agile execution of rapid scale passages. Well, not everything that we sing in Western classical has a rapid, has this agility factor. Not everything. Some things really don't, but some things do. And also, what do all the riffs that that are pop singers, R&B singers, like what are those riffs if not agility, rapid scale passages, right? Accurate. Agile execution of rapid scale passages. So that's in other styles as well. However, when we get if we put all of those in a Venn diagram, and all of those little things, we put them in a Venn diagram, and then the middle, where we see those circles all kind of coming together, the middle part, that's a fairly accurate representation of what Western classical singing is. So I think that's as close as we can get to a definition, and I'm not even going to try to do a definition of like classical music, like Western classical music. No thanks. I'm just going to say, like, in terms of Western classical singing, that is likely our Venn diagram where we have those traits, and they all where they overlap in the middle. That's where we get our classical singing, or Western classical singing. So, like, what are the actual traits? That's my question. Should we define it, or do we just know when we see it? So here's where we get into this. This is my next question about Western classical singing. Here's where we get into this thing where we say, when we say we have to define this thing, when we say that we have to have these hard and fast rules about what it is, when we are not using the Venn diagram, but we're using a list, it's just her short definition, and like, I'm sure there are other things that could be in there for sure, but like, that's just her short definition in like the middle of her book. So no tonal outcomes. I know, no tonal outcomes included in that list. So basically, I think that's part of the reason I actually like it, is because there's no, this is all about like how you create the sound and not necessarily what the product is, right? So I think the understanding here is that if you are creating the sound in that specific way, then the product is going to sound Western classical. So should we define it? So here's where we get into the issue. When we stop using a Venn diagram kind of definition for anything, we start to become, we start to get into the one true way, right? We start to get into the like, you must do it this way, you must do it this way. Here's the list, and if you don't check off all of the things on this list, then you're not doing it right. We start to get into the moral, we get into Western classical elitism is what we get into, right? So we get into these moral, this moral quagmire around what is good, what is Western classical, aka good, and what is not Western classical singing. So should we define it? I think it depends on how you define. So if you're going to, yes, sure, we can define it, but let's make sure that we're using a definition that is not a list of do's or don'ts, but is rather a whole bunch of circles that when they kind of come together, you've got the thing in the middle. So that gives us options. And it removes the you must out of the equation. The other thing that this does is it helps to remove gatekeeping. Now, gatekeeping in Western classical music is a big issue. Gatekeeping in all art forms is a big issue, right? It's an issue. And I think I should not say we would all. I think that lots of folks would agree. Go there. Michelle, you are good for me. I think that lots of folks would agree that there is very much a lot of gatekeeping going on in Western classical singing, in opera, in auditions, in et cetera, right? There's a lot of gatekeeping going on. So part of the reason for this is, the history of Western classical singing, et cetera, and this need for us to define it and hold on to it, right? So we got to hold on to it and defend this art form, because otherwise it's going to get away from us and someone else is going to do something that doesn't sound like it, and then where will we be? So this need to I had to learn how to do it right, and so now you have to learn how to do it right, and I had to go through I had to get thin in order to get hired, so you do too. I had to like all of the gatekeeping things that come into play, right? So this, let me give you an example of something that's very interesting that just happened here in Toronto. So the Toronto School Board decided, we have louder. So the Toronto School Board decided, okay, let me backtrack a second. We have several arts schools that are in Toronto that are audition only art schools, right? So you go there and the arts program is you have to achieve a certain level of expertise in dancing, singing, drama, fine art, all of the arts, in order to be accepted, playing an instrument, in order to be accepted into the school. So you have to audition or submit a portfolio, et cetera, in order to be admitted into the school. So, of course, this is a form of gatekeeping, 100%, and a form of elitism of 100%. And so the school board decided, in its infinite wisdom, that no one would have to audition anymore. That if you wanted to go to the school because you have an interest, all you have to do is check a box that says, I'm interested in, being a fine artist. I'm interested in being a dancer. I'm interested in being a singer. I'm interested in playing trumpet. I'm interested in etc. You just had to check that box. This is going in this year, I think. And then anybody can go to the art school. So long as you just show an interest, you can go to the art school. And that was the school board's solution to an elitism problem and to a racism problem and to a gatekeeping problem. Like, that was the school board solution. Y'all, that is not a good solution. That's not a good solution. A solution to a gatekeeping problem is to change the system that caused the gatekeeping problem in the first place, right? That's the solution. So the solution is that we either create a parallel program, because, like, here's the thing, only people who have, who are at least middle class can afford to take the voice lessons, to get their kids in voice lessons in order for them to be able to, have the expertise to audition for an art school, right? So yes, it is a problem. This is a problem, 100%. We are definitely missing out on folks who are not able to acquire the expertise through finances, or just not knowing about the fact that there's an art school, right? If you're brand new to this country, you don't know that there's an art school that your kid could audition for if they had the expertise. You don't know that. So, like, there is so much going on here, right? In terms of the system is not good. Yay for the school board for recognizing that this is not a good system. Stupid solution, though. Why? Because you're not fixing the problem. The problem isn't that people can't, that's not the problem. The problem is in the system, right? The problem is in, right? The problem is in the whole system leading up to the audition. So yeah, there may be some gatekeeping already in the audition process, for sure. But, like, the whole thing leading up to the audition is the problem. So what we should be doing is creating programs for kids who do not have either the financial resources or the understanding of what's out there. We should be creating programs for them, and we should be creating parallel programs for folks who didn't know, don't have the expertise, don't have the expertise yet. So a parallel program where in that first year they're getting their grade 8 trumpet, or they're learning their first level of ballet, or they're getting their their grade 6 voice, or whatever it is that they need to do in order to have the level of expertise, or they have all of the art supplies given to them and they have a tutor in order to figure out how to do pottery, etc., etc. So we can create this parallel program so that then they do have the expertise to be able to be in the arts program. We don't just, like, anyway, that was a little bit of a sidestep, but relevant to what I'm talking about here, where there is, this is the other thing that I'm talking about, in terms of Western classical singing, the coordination that's required to create Western classical tonal outcomes requires us to be trained. The body doesn't do it necessarily all on its own, right? Obviously, there's some folks who do get, who acquire a level of expertise with less training, and then there are folks who need more training. Whatever, it's all good, that's fine, but that's what this requires. That's what Western classical training requires. These tonal outcomes require this specific kind of coordination that does require training. So what happens? Only the people who can afford to get lessons, and who want to, right? Like, who wants to learn Western classical singing? It's not, some folks don't want to, and that's fair. Only people who can afford to are then able to go to the specific schools, and are able to go to then the next level in the schools, and then are able to, like, get the training that they need, and are able to, go to the YAPs and do this whole pipeline around Western classical training is part of the systemic problem. I mean, it's part of the problem, right? This whole pipeline is part of the problem, and we're not addressing it right from the beginning. So then we have gatekeepers. So I think at the one of the other questions that I'm asking here, that I was asking in my post about Western classical training is it possible to acknowledge both that classical singing is a rarefied art form and that it has a big old gatekeeping problem? I mean, I think it's possible to acknowledge those things, right? Like, yes, it takes training to be able to sing, to be able to have, well, these things that she talks about, right? It takes training to be able to negotiate a large pitch range, to have to be coordinated for sustained breathing, to be able to be heard without amplification. It takes training to have seamless register shifts. It takes training to have an agile execution of rapid scale passages. Like, all of these things take training. So that's fine. So what do we do in order to create the training? How do we create this system? And that's part of what makes it a rarefied art form. So why is it a rarefied art form? I'm not saying it's a high art form. I'm just saying, well, maybe rarefied does mean. I'm just saying it is an art form where it requires a lot of training in order to be able to execute all of these things in the Venn diagram. So in order to execute those things, only the people who are able to get the training are going to get the training. So then only the people who are now in charge of who gets into all of the programs are the people who got the training themselves and who are like, well, I had to go through all that training, and so now you do too, because you don't know how to blah, blah. So it can be both and, right? I love this art form. I love Western classical singing. I love opera. I love art song. I love it. And at the same time, I understand that there is a gatekeeping problem in this industry, right? One of the things I wanted to say too was, like, it's interesting too that in this definition, in this kind of Venn diagram, is that, like, tuning is not in that definition, right? Like, accurate tuning is not in that definition. And it's very interesting, like, we talk about, well, classical singers are, they sing in tune all the time. Yeah? Have you ever listened to Joyce DiDonato live? Fully a third of the time, she is not singing in tune. And go listen to some of her live recordings. Lots of it's not in tune. Nope. We still love her. Is she still a Western classical singer? Yep, she is. I still love her. I have no problem with that, but a lot of times she's not singing in tune. So does that mean, right? So again, there's that Venn diagram of the definition. So we've got all of these things, like, in tune most of the time. I don't know. How do we describe it? Okay. And then one other question here. What does classical music lose when it evolves and maybe no longer sounds classical to attract a larger audience? And potentially, what does it gain? So again, I think, we have all of this, like, hand wringing in the industry. I've been to lots of symposiums about, how do we make sure that art song is relevant for the next generation, and how do we support composers, and how do we make sure that, that this art form continues on. And so we get this, like, hand wringing. We get this, like, oh no, and we've got to defend the art form. And I think, or we either have to defend the art form and keep it pristine, or we have to, like, dilute it somehow in order to make it palatable and to bring in the new audience, right? To bring in more people in the audience. And we have all of this, like, how do we get more people into the opera houses? How do we get more, music theater is taking all of the audiences, and no one's ever going to come and see an opera again, blah, blah, blah. But that doesn't recognize the fact that opera is this rarefied art form. So yes, you can change or evolve, and that may bring more people in. But at some point, we've got to say to ourselves, hey, this is what Western classical singing looks and sounds like. This Venn diagram, not saying there's a list, but this Venn diagram is what it looks and sounds like, what it can be. And so the people who come are the people who come, the people who love it. And if I change this thing, if I start to do this and if I start to do that, I may get more people, but are they then going to be there for the rest of the other things that we, like, for the other stuff that we do? Maybe, maybe not. So there are people there are folks who are creating spaces and creating the kinds of who are doing this evolution work in opera, in classical singing, in art song, that still kind of fall within the Venn diagram, right? They still kind of fall within the like, oh yeah, that's recognizable as Western classical singing or Western classical music. And those folks are still bringing in the same people. Like, anyway, this particular one is maybe a little bit bigger than what I can do today. But just something to consider, right? Like, how are we? It comes back, I think, to how are we defining a whole genre? Like, how are we defining that genre? And if we're defining it by checklists, if we're defining it by all of those check marks, and it has to be this list of things, we're going to be gatekeeping like crazy. We are going to be holding on to and defending this art form from a very unstable place. Unstable is the wrong word. Defensive place where like you don't know what you're doing and I do, and so and anybody who doesn't like this art form is a terrible person, and I'm a good person because I like high art, etc., etc. We're going to be defending this art form in a way that is not worthy of it. It's not worthy. It is so much more than your defense of it. Yes. So, final question. Final thing that I'm going to leave that one there. Final thing that I wanted to say. Why am I so annoyingly persistent about saying Western classical singing? So, the only reason I'm so persistent about that. Oh, thanks, Suzanne. Oh, I'm so glad. Yeah, just something to make you think, right? Like, how do we define this? And is my definition actually a list, like a checklist? Or do I have this like Venn diagram and there's lots of things that can actually fit in and fit out? Like what things can, yeah. Before I say that, let me just say, sometimes our defense of Western classical singing reminds me of sort of the way we often defend God, if you will. We'll say, well, God doesn't like that, and God doesn't like this, and look, it's right here in the Bible. And I feel like, isn't God big enough to do this? Him, her, themselves? Like, isn't your God big enough to figure it out and to like, do you really have to be the person who's like, do you really have to defend God? How big is your God exactly? How powerful is your God exactly? If like, you have to be the one defending them, right? So it feels a little bit like that argument, sorry if that feels offensive. I don't mean it that way. I just mean it like, it feels the same way that we defend Western classical singing, where we're like, well, it has to be this and it has to be that and it has to be this. Well, can it not, is there not a way that it can be all of these options rather than like us being on the defense? Okay, my final thought here. Why am I so annoyingly consistent about saying Western classical, and why do I say it at all? So I started to say Western classical singing. I started to use that descriptor about 2 years ago, maybe a little further, but I think about 2 years ago now. Actually just about 2 years ago, because it was farther back than that. That was when it was sort of solidified. So so this is probably going back 4 or 5 years now, actually, when for some reason I had several Eastern classical students come into the studio. And obviously I was not teaching them how to, like, their style. I don't know Eastern classical singing, and I don't know the style. What they were coming to me for was one was a teenager whose voice was getting more and more tired and hoarse as they tried to sing in this Eastern classical style, and she was playing an instrument too. The name of it has escaped me now. So sitting on the floor, like sitting with the instrument and singing at the same time. So she was getting more and more hoarse and tired, and her voice was not, she wasn't able to do some of the things that she wanted to be able to do. And so they had heard about me, blah, blah, blah. Someone else on the opposite side of this, on the opposite side where their voice was, they were losing their high notes, and so they couldn't, I mean, it's similar kinds of issues, right? But they were losing their high notes, and they're, singing singing Eastern Classical. And then I worked closely with someone who was an Eastern Classical teacher as well, and that was just 2 years ago. So, oh, Kate, that's really interesting. Yeah, thank you. So I started to work with folks who are Eastern Classical musicians. And it's, okay, greetings from Spain. I love it. And I realized that every time I said classical, that I was making an assumption about what we all mean by classical, right? And I mean, we already talked about like the definition, but I was making this big assumption about what classical means. And so the folks I was working with who are Eastern classical musicians were like, don't know what you're talking about right now. I mean, they did because they are here in Western culture. But like, so that started to just clarify for me a little bit. And also what I love about saying what I love about Western classical is that it every time it comes out of my face, it's a reminder to me that I and my style and like the style of singing that I studied, that I have like 3 performance degrees in, is not the only style. And it's not the only classical style, right? It's not the only kind of classical singing out there. It just takes me out of like my very much closed and small space, right? It gives me this, I feel like every time I say it, it gives me this wider perspective and just reminds me, oh yeah, that's right. There's lots of other classical styles out there. It's not just us who have this sort of, it's not just us over here in the West who have this like rarefied art form around singing, right? So that's why I use it. And you are welcome to use it or not use it. I'm not telling anybody else that they have to use it, of course. And let me make sure that I got all of the questions here. What do we lose? What do we gain? What does, why am I, So of course, I'm not saying anybody needs to say that thing, but consider it, right? Think about it and think about what it means, especially, I mean, I'm up here in Canada, working with singers. Thank you, Wendy. Take care. Working with lots of singers from lots of different cultures and backgrounds and different heritage. And so what does it mean when we say Western classical? Now, some might argue that Russia is, the Russian tradition may or may not be Western classical as well because of their position in the world, but because of where they are geographically, so who knows. But all I'm saying is it's my way of reaching toward a better description that is more inclusive, right? It's my way of just sort of reaching toward a description that is more inclusive and that acknowledges the fact that this is not the only kind of classical singing there is. Doesn't center Western classical singing the same way. Yeah. When I say just classical, it kind of centers Western classical singing, right? Yeah. So that's all I'm going to say now. That's all I'm going to say. Some things to just think about today, right? Think about what is your definition of classical singing, especially, and what does the Venn diagram look like? Sorry about my necklaces, they're driving me crazy now. What does the Venn diagram look like for that, for you, for classical singing? And that also, I think by thinking about what does that look like, what does that categorization look like, and what are the things that I have in these circles, in this diagram, what are the things that I have in those circles, that then might help us to clarify what we're actually teaching too, right? I think that'll help us. That'll help us coming back to what I was talking about at the very beginning. That will help us even when we do have an excellent functional understanding of the voice. I think that will also then help us to understand, okay, when I'm working on these things that are in these circles, they might also be really useful. Like I can see that the Venn diagram for like, I don't know, extended breathing, say, I can see that might also then go over into, let's say, I don't know, I can't even think of another. Might also go over into like papara maybe, or might go over into like, I could see how some of these blending registers might also then, end up over here. So you can see how some of these things can, go into Venn diagrams for other styles too. Okay. That's all for today, folks. Have a terrific day. I hope this is giving you something to just kind of consider. I am not going to be live next week at a regular time anyway, because I'm going to be over in Chicago at the NATS conference. And a week today, is it a week today that I'm presenting? On the Friday. Yes, so presenting a week today with my good friends and colleagues Sara Campbell and Canadian Sara Campbell and Gabriela Farias. So we're presenting on. You're so welcome. Thank you. Oh, I'm glad. Yeah, we'll try. We're presenting on classroom strategies for the independent voice studio. So we're going to look at some of the, specifically looking at backward design and understanding goal setting and how to like have some. How to apply in the independent voice studio. So that is going to be a lot of fun. And then I'll be at my booth over with the Secovians, over with the Seco folks. So I'll be at my booth there with buttons. And if you're a Canadian and you're at the Chicago thing, come and find me because I'm going to bring a whole bunch of buttons for Canadians. Where are they? Oh, I can't find my buttons. Anyway, I'll bring some buttons. So we can wear them on Canada Day because we're going to be in the United States of America on Canada Day. Don't want to do that. Anyway, take good care. I will not see you next week unless you're in Chicago, and then I will likely see you the week after that. Take care. End this video. Boop. Oh, let's end it.